Hello everyone, welcome to round 4 of the lichess Crazyhouse World Championship for 2018. This is a Saturday morning Sydney time, a match between myself, Mugwort, and Grandmaster FeegLood. So it's a Saturday morning in Sydney, and this is a recording of the match, which was played yesterday on Saturday. Now already FeegLood, after 2 moves, has me out of book. I have not seen this move knight d4 before, and I'm a little bit confused already what to do. Knight f3, I'm taking my time here because I realized he's going to gain a tempo if queen takes, and knight at d4, probably queen d1 will be the best move. It looks like I've wasted a little bit of time. It's not so easy to kick that knight on d4 away. If queen d3, he'll probably just defend with e5. So I haven't seen this before. Perhaps knight ge2 was a safer way to play and take back with the bishop and preserve a tempo. And if I took g takes f3, then knight at d4 anyway, and it's still very hard to kick that knight out of the way. So I'm just seeing if I have any options. I was actually considering a sacrifice on f7. I thought, since I just woken up, 10 or 20 minutes ago, and I'm not feeling 100% clear in my head, that's very risky. Now, obviously, FeegLood has 3 minutes and 3 seconds left after 4 moves, so I would imagine he's prepared this as a surprise opening. So I found out after the game, one of the observers here is the finisher, and he said queen takes f7 leads to a forced draw. And I haven't checked it myself, but I'd rather not take a draw in game 1 with the white pieces. So let's go queen d1, e6, bishop c4. It's not so easy for him to get in the move d5, which he would sometimes do in a French defense kind of setup to knock around the bishop and gain a tempo that way. Queen h4. Wow, this is really unusual play from black. I don't know what he's even threatening with this move. Should I castle? Should I play d3 and bishop e3 and knock around the knight on d4 that way? Decide to go with d3. I thought maybe he's anticipating if castles either bishop d6 or knight f6 to g4. If h3, maybe even h5, the old fishing pole trap in chess. Okay, so bishop e3 looks good, but now he's going to answer bishop c5, and you can see he's playing very fast. So this is not such a good trade for me, because then if I guard f2 by castling, again he's going to follow up with knight g4, or maybe even bishop at e5, hitting c3 as well. Probably knight g4 is stronger. So, 50 seconds. I would normally not take this amount of time in the opening, but I'm really wary of a trap, because there's many ways for white to go wrong here. I don't think knight at f3, which I'm hovering over, will be such a good move due to the mass trades, and black gets the initiative. So looking for a solution. Doesn't seem to be threatening to hit f2 at the moment, so I decided to counter attack on c7. But this is a really sneaky move. Knight g4, 18 seconds left. Obviously I can't castle. He's threatening knight takes bishop on e3, and I found a good idea. So to grab a pawn, put it back on g3 with tempo. He's going to bring the queen back to f6 to still threaten knight takes e3, but then I want to make that trade in my favor, so I'm going to follow that up by castles kingside. So expecting queen back to f6. Knight takes bishop was possibly another option, but I seem to have all the key squares guarded. Maybe even just pawn takes knight after that. So castles, now I'm finally safe. The main problem, of course, is the clock. 12 seconds. We are playing 3+2, a 10-game match, so there is an increment of 2 seconds. But the way he's played so far, he's thrown in a lot of unexpected moves, and he's really hustling me, pressuring me on time. So the clock is my biggest enemy here. Now if he takes on c7, I'll just answer by bishop takes knight on d4, and then either knight at b5 or d5 to follow up. Probably knight at d5. His knight on g4 is also hanging, and as mentioned, the trade on e3 doesn't seem to help, because then that opens the f file for the rook. So the knight on c7 is defended by tricks, defended by tactics. I thought he might have some knight takes c2 trick, but nothing seems to work. The position is looking good. He's spending a lot of time trying to find a resource. Queen takes f3 also possible, but I thought that pawn takes was a bit safer. My king's going to have to run to the corner. King g2 was another possibility, just to try and stop his pawn at h3. Now, of course, I have to drop something to defend g2. Knight at e1 seems safe enough, because I'd rather him have knights, not pawns and bishops at the moment. Although if he gets too many knights, eventually he'll have a drop on f4 and h4. And I do have to be very careful with the amount of material that I give back. So he's defended the rook, but now the knight comes back to make room for a pawn at c7. As soon as I get a pawn in hand, I'll just drop it straight back on c7. Now, of course, that's what FeegLood has to consider if he's willing to give a pawn with pawn takes knight. Because a couple of knights for him, and then suddenly my king is back in danger. So it's a double-edged position. I felt like white should be a lot better with some careful play. So knight at f4. I'm just going to drop back and not exchange, because I still want to get in this pawn at c7 move. So only one knight and a pawn in hand. I could drop on g3 at any time, and I don't see how I'm getting mated here. That check maybe not necessary, but bishop at g3 should keep me safe. He's going to try and trick me with some knight at f4, but I'll drop on g2. I could have dropped a knight perhaps on g2. The other option was bishop takes knight on f4, but 4 seconds. Bishop takes knight was possible there. I got to watch out not to get mated. 3 seconds. Now I have to drop the pawn on e7. This is the only defense. Unfortunately, I was just hesitating because I wasn't sure whether to attack or defend, but pawn at e7 still survived with a big advantage. Check followed by knight f5. Knight to f5 check, and then the knight can come back to e3, take the bishop, because the bishop was defending the escape square on g1. So very unfortunate finish. I just had to make the move because pawn at e7 was the only move anyway, and I should have just done it without thinking. Even if I didn't see the follow-up, it hopefully would have come to me. Now this opening, this is game number 2. You can see down the bottom we have a lifetime record on lichess of 3 games to 4 since I lost that game on time. So going into the match, a lot of people were saying, it's about 50-50 who wins between us. Now, as far as preparation goes, because FeegLood has not played a lot of games on lichess in Crazyhouse, he seems to be very good at all variants, but there wasn't really much to go on to study. This opening, however, I was prepared for, because c3, there's a couple of people that play this c3 against the Italian opening, and although castling is a bit unusual, I did know this pawn at h3 move basically just busts the whole system, so I did know this before the match. And as far as preparation goes, this is probably all I'm going to get in, and this is just 1 game out of 10, of course. So yeah, after pawn at e2 in this position, it's just completely winning for black. There's no move left for white. So the idea of pawn at h3 is, so when I grab a pawn back on e4 with the knight, he's got to defend the light squares and the dark squares at the same time, and it's really very difficult to do. I mean, there's ways for white to play a little bit better to slow down black's attack, but it's always going to be at least a bit better for black this opening. So the obvious trick being queen takes e2 will be followed by knight to g3 check, followed by queen takes queen. Just a chess tactic, a discovered attack on the queen. He's trying to complicate things by sacking a bishop and maybe the knight's interfering on e5 or coming to g5 with check. So he's probably hoping for knight takes g5 and then he can pick off the pawn on f2 with check. But I'm already preparing something in my mind. So as you can see, I'm playing a lot faster this game because this is, well, it was known to me up to about move 9 or so, pawn to e3. So already after 11 moves, black has a winning position. There's just nothing left for white here, so it's I'm expecting it's going to be over in about 4 or 5 moves. Yeah, you can see in the video there, just having a sip of coffee. Yeah, and queen takes g5. I thought about king e8 briefly, but just double checking queen takes g5. It's certainly the fastest way to win because knight at g3 check is just unstoppable after queen takes knight on g5. Yeah, there's too many threats, so white resigns. It's about mate in 3 or mate in 4 or something. Okay, so second game with white. Now he's going to go knight c6, and knight f3 avoids this whole mumbo jumbo with knight d4. I just don't even want to get into that again. Even though I survived the opening, we'll go into more familiar territory for me. So there's quite a lot of people that play this way from the black side. And pawn at g4 would be the main move here. Knight back to b6, knight back to f6, knight f4, they're all possible moves. Okay, so pawn on g4 is hanging, he's really got to play h5, that's it, d4. There's quite a lot of moves here for black. So this opening in particular is very hard to study because there are just so many possible ideas for both players. What I tend to do in preparation is draw on my previous experience in terms of themes. So there's several themes which will repeat. Like pawn at h6 idea is very common for white. Black does usually want trades in this opening. So if he can get in knight takes d4 and swap bishops and swap queens, this is generally favorable for black because then he'll start dropping stuff on the light squares like h3 and f3. My knight on e1 is very handy to guard the square on g2 in case that sort of thing happens later. But I just generally want to avoid trades, and d5 is probably not the best move. I was trying to take advantage of the weakness on g6 and f7. And also trying to make him put a pawn back on the board on e6 to block out the queen from hitting f7. So that was the idea, but he still does have a knight in hand. Of course, he's gaining a tempo, pushing the queen back to d1. He still has a knight in hand, and he's probably going to follow up after queen d1 with bishop d6, and then I've got to be careful always about a sack on h2. Followed by queen h4 check, and with the knight in hand, it's potentially going to h3, h4, f3, any of these squares. So just double checking there's no better move, but queen d1 seems to be the safest. So he can't hit the queen again with tempo. Now expecting bishop d6. Maybe knight to e5, trying for some trades is also possible, but he's going to end up with a knight back on d7. Maybe that's not so good. All right, now, do I defend? Do I block the diagonal? Pawn at f4 is possible. Pawn at h6 if I want to go for an attack. Trying to take over his 7th rank on g7. Very hard to say what the best move is, and that's, you know, if you don't know exact lines, it's also very difficult, as I mentioned, to study because there's just so many different options. Where to put the bishop, when to start dropping stuff on h3 and f3 for black. He might sack the bishop on h2. He's probably not going to leave it there, so I'm expecting either a sack or maybe bishop back to e7. Bishop e5 is also possible. I'm not expecting this move because it can be hit with tempo. So knight's quite useful on e4. It does cover a lot of the dark squares, which he's probing with the bishop. Maybe I could play bishop g5 to follow up. Trying to lock his queen out from reaching the square h4. All right, bishop e5. Now I could hit it with knight d3. I could hit it with pawn at f4. Again, pawn at f4 would be the safest move. Now knight d3, there is actually a problem with this move. Now the sack on h2 is stronger than it was before. It's not so easy to see, but there's some sequence of moves where he can play bishop takes h2, knight at f3 check, distracting the g pawn, and then queen h4 check. And I'm having a lot of problems guarding all the squares around the king, in particular h2, h3, g2. And this actually turns out good for black. So I'm getting very worried here about a sack on h2. Not so easy to see because that would be sacrificing two pieces, but it would turn out that any trade after that is good for black. Any trade of pieces. Knight at h3 I was not expecting. I should probably take it because even though his pawn gets to h3, he doesn't have any pieces in hand, or except for a pawn. I can always play rook e1, and the attack is far from being decisive. So here he sacrificed two pieces in a row. Bishop on h2, knight on f2. I have three ways to take it back. Maybe the knight from d3 back to f2 was the safest, but because that way I still have a knight covering g3. These two pawns in hand, plus ideas of pushing h4, g3, even h4, h3, opening the rook on h8, does look extremely dangerous. Black is developing an initiative. White has a material advantage. It's really a battle here between an initiative versus material. So looking at knight takes, but I'm very worried about h4 coming, so I finally decided to take it with the king. So I'm now looking at king takes g3, expecting h4 check, and I'm now looking at king h3 after h4 check. So if he does a discovered check e5, I can just block on g4, for instance, or f5. Oh, that was unexpected, hitting the knight. I could move the knight, but I decided to counterattack pawn at g6. If he takes the knight, of course, f7 is a big problem. Drop on f7 with check. And this move, bishop at g5, blocks out his queen pretty much for the rest of the game. Well, I hope so. Ideas of pawn at f6 followed by pawn at h6 check. If he takes the bishop on g5, then I'll take on g7 check, followed by bishop takes with the one on c1, bishop on c1. So he's dropped all his pawns in hand. He's grabbing a rook on f2. Now I'm just checking to see if taking the queen is safe. It is, because even though he wins the queen with rook at g1, the queen by itself is not enough to do much damage to my king. He needs quite a few pieces in hand to do a lot of damage. Maybe a knight and a few pawns, for instance. So he's doing it anyway. He might take back the bishop on d8. But here there's several ways to attack. So knight at h7 I thought was most direct. If he takes, there's g8 hanging. And now just why not open the first rank for the rook? He drops here, drop on c5. He could take on f7, but I'll probably just grab a knight in hand with bishop takes c6. Okay, he sacked the queen. I'm going to grab as much material as I can before sacking the queen back. So I just want to attack quickly here. He can't take it because of queen at c5, bishop at d6, rook at b8, checkmate. Because he has very limited resources, I'm just going to take that knight for g5 or e5. His checks are running out, so I was very confident of taking this one out. He's attacking the queen, doesn't matter. Yeah, so it's about mate in 3. Alright, so this was game number 3. Very exciting finish. Although he's got a lot of pawns in defense, I was just able to jump over them and sneak around and force the king to a square where he's smothered by the pawns. Okay, so 2-1 to Mugwort. This is game number 4. Now he's varying his openings here. He's playing a 4-knight Scotch. Maybe expecting a trade on c6. I wasn't quite sure which way to take back. Even thinking about d takes. No, he's gone knight f5. Alright, so looking at rook g8, but I actually think castling is the best move in this position. Now I want to follow this up by playing d5 on the next move and chopping the knight away as fast as possible. Now, of course, it does allow pawn at h6 or knight sack on g7, but I'm ready for this. As soon as that bishop moves to g5, away from c1 though, I don't think this is the best move because it allows pawn at a3. Now, if this was Bughouse, I would have played pawn at a3 in 1 second, but just double checking that the trade on f6 is no problem. It doesn't look like it. I mean, maybe he should play bishop f6 and knight back at d5. Although he's still not really making a dent on my king in that sort of position. Hard to say what the best move is here for white. If he wants to preserve as much material as possible, he could play rook b1 and pawn at d2, but I will still answer d7 to d5 anyway. So, yeah, I'm reasonably happy with my position here. Feeling like I'm going to pick up a little bit of material soon. The advantage of trading an f6 and knight at d5, it does cover c3. So he sacked the piece. I don't want to grab the rook on a1 because then there's too much pressure on f6. He could then follow up even pawn at h6, for instance, to undermine the knight again. Now the sharpest move looks like knight takes e4, followed by bishop or knight takes on d2. So here he may have to sack the queen back on d2. So again, we get into these completely wild double-edged positions where anything can happen. So here I want to get rid of the pawn. I don't mind sacking a queen to do it because I'm going to have big chances to attack on the square d2. So I can see I've got a bit of Aussie support. Down the bottom left you can see Master Tan and John Lee have joined as observers. Those guys don't observe too many games, so obviously they're here to support the Aussie. Alright, now it turns out pawn at e3 was a much stronger move than knight takes d2 on move number 12. Pawn at e3, intending to open up all those dark squares on f2 and d2. So I missed this move, queen at g3. Very nice resource from FeegLood, because even though I can drop the bishop back to g7, the problem is my knight is then hanging on d2, the rook is also hanging on f8. Too many problems if I drop the bishop back, so I thought the best chance was to drop the pawn. And to preserve the knight with knight to e4, a rook to e8 was also an option after queen takes c3. But to retain attacking chances, I would rather preserve the knight with knight to e4. Even though rook e8 is actually objectively stronger. Because this move, I'm tempting him to sack on g7. And just asking him, does he have enough? He could take the pawn with check, he could take the rook on f8. In that case, he has pawn, bishop, rook in hand. It doesn't look like enough to mate. Well, that's what I was thinking during the game. So I'm actually expecting a sack on g7. I mean, he's probably going to have to sack the queen anyway when I play pawn at d2 next. Because, yeah, that pawn, to stay on the second rank, there's just too many tricks with knight at c3 or knight at c1 to follow. And I have 3 knights in hand. All right, he's done it. Followed up very quickly with queen d4 check, wanting to pick up the knight on e4. As it turns out, queen g4 check was the move in the position, because when I block, he's then got bishop at d4 check, which stops my next move, which is queen at c3 check. So this was the right move order for white. Now black has serious counter chances, trying to take the rook on a1 with check, and then just drop knights and rooks everywhere. So covering the square f6 is important by the queen, because that way, at the very least, I can sack back on f6 if he drops a knight back on f6. Assuming I'm going to run out of checks in a couple of moves. And I'm looking at king e2, followed by knight at d4 check. Queen takes d4, queen takes d4. Knight at f6, queen takes f6, bishop takes f6. And I'm seeing if I have a mate. So this is the line that actually happens in the game. Now that bishop on f6, it's a very good defender. It's an amazing defender because it stops knight checks on c3, d4. If I go knight at f4, then king d1, and again I have no knight check. I have no queen check or pawn check, and I think white would be winning after knight at f4, king d1. So, I mean, I can throw in rook e8. Of course, he's not going to go knight at e7 check, because just rook takes and then the bishop is deflected off the key squares. He's dropping a pawn, which is the right move. So, 20 seconds. I have to find a good move here, because knight at f4 is not enough. And I'm dropping the queen on the right square. a6, I'm very happy to find this move. Just double checking I've got nothing better. So this is the move that picks off the most important piece, which is the bishop on f6. As you can see, there's no way to block and also guard the bishop at the same time. So I'm quite confident, even though I've got 10 seconds, that I'm going to come away with a win in game 4. I mean, still have to put in a bit of effort and not lose concentration, but yeah, black is going to have a material advantage, a safe king with opportunities to attack with knight at c3 or d4 or f4. And it's funny how the bishops are all stuck. The rooks are stuck in the corner, you know, h1, f1, a8, c8, but it's more about the pieces in hand in this game and maximizing the potential with the pieces in hand. And also, as you can see, if he drops the bishop on d3, it's not that useful to hit on h7, because the dark squares are much more important to control than the light squares here. Alright, so he's doing what he can to attack with limited resources. I'm looking at check, but then I realized with 3 seconds left, his knight takes h6 is not enough to mate, because the king's going to the corner, he's taking on f7, and the queen on a1 covers g7, which is the most important thing here. So even though he's got a couple more checks, it's not going to be enough, and mainly because the queen on a1 is covering f6 and g7. So he can't just go queen g6 check, then take on g7, because the queen covers. So he's sacking the queen, pawn blocks on f7, and that's it. He's only got a rook and 3 pawns, not enough to mate. Okay, that was game number 4. So very intense battle so far. Let's continue. We get about 2 seconds break and we're starting again. Game number 5. So we're going to do the same opening again. So I did win game number 3 with white, but it was a very tough battle where he sacrificed 2 pieces for the initiative and got lots of pawns in hand. So, of course, with these pawns advanced on h5 and g4, if he gets a couple more pawns, then he can very quickly crack open these light squares on g2, h3, and so on. So what he's doing on the queen side is just trying to stop any sort of counterattack from white. Now, f3 is not the best move, and I had seen this idea g3 once before. Not in this exact position, but it's hard to believe that I can't just take that and put a pawn back on h2. But if I take it, then h4 is coming. main problem is here that g3 is going to be a massive weakness. Like whether I take, whether I push, whether I put a pawn back on g or h2, there's long-term weaknesses around my king. So I'm trying to stop the opening of the h file, but he's going to open it anyway with h3. So I really can't stop it in the long term. Maybe I should have dropped a pawn on h5, but still the queen is finding its way into h4, bishop d6 and so on. I'm looking at g3, but that just doesn't seem to work. He's also going to resource knight takes d4, trading off bishops and getting a pawn in hand for g2. So now I changed my mind. I'm going back to pawn takes pawn. Rook takes, maybe drop the pawn back on g2. But it's the dark squares here which are the serious weakness. Yeah, I don't really have a better move than pawn at g2. Just trying to gain the tempo so I can put another pawn back on h2. And if he goes pawn at h2, then king h1, rook comes back, and then pawn at h3 completes the diamond. And no, actually probably pawn at f2 is a better move in that case, to stop his pawn at g3. Bishop f4 also would be nice for white, but black is going to be quick to counterattack. So because he's taking his time here, I'm assuming he's looking at a sacrifice, just leaving the rook dangling there on h3, which is what happens. So knight takes d4, very strong move. And here, I really need to trade the bishop on d7, because yeah, if I take the knight on d4, I have to waste time saving the queen, and he's also got numerous threats after bishop takes b5 or bishop at c5. There's pawn at e2, there's bishop at h2, there's bishop takes f1. There's too many angles to cover. So I really needed to get rid of that bishop on d7 instead of queen takes d4. So it's already lost for white, and I realized I was in massive trouble. Because if I save the queen, like queen, I don't know, f4 or queen f2 or something, I'm going to run into something, whether it's a pawn at g3 or bishop at g3. Maybe queen h4 in some cases. Yeah, I mean, I'd like time to pick off the rook on h3, but with the queen hanging, this is the biggest problem. So I decided to go for material and take the queen, but no, the square I'm pointing at g3, this is going to be fatal. So I wasn't quite sure whether the queen at h1 led to a forced mate, followed by bishop at g3. I'd probably have to run to e3 in that case, but then he's picking up material with queen takes rook on f1. But yeah, I realized that something at g3, like pawn or a bishop at g3, is just going to be fatal for white. Yeah, there we go. So obvious threats on h1 and h2. I just can't cover all the squares. I think the only move, I mean, I can drop a bishop on to make him waste a pawn, but it's not going to make the slightest difference. This is already lost, so very well played from FeegLood here. I mean, I have to put a pawn on h2. It's not going to change anything, because both h1 and h2 have to be covered, and it's not possible after rook takes h2. So yeah, it's a forced mate here for black. The trick is a square vacation with rook to h1. And doesn't matter that the knight guards the rook because there's the mate next move on h2. Alright, so FeegLood comes back. 3 games to 2. I still have a slight edge. Playing black. Now, black has won. How many of these games so far? 1, 2, 3, 4. Black has won 4 games out of 5. Very surprising, because in Crazyhouse you would expect white to win maybe 70 to 80% of the time. Alright, so he switched up his openings, d4, d5. So sometimes I played the Dutch defense with d4, f5. I had a little bit of recent experience with Yasser in the 24-hour Opperweisen Crazyhouse Endurance. But would rather play a more solid opening against d4. So d4, d5. And I'm just intending to castle kingside, just play normal moves for 8 or 9 moves, and just see what happens from there. Yeah, I mean, looking at knight e4, but yeah, I just don't want to leave the pawn on d5 dangling, so I'll just go to e6. Maybe put the bishop on e7 or d6, castle kingside. And both sides are quite solid. I think with moves like a3, I don't think either side's going to have any advantage out of the opening. I thought about copying with a6, but the moves themselves are not so critical at this stage because, you know, both sides are aiming for just easy development, no weaknesses, safe king. I think it's an equal position so far. I decided to play a6 to stop knight b5 because I do want to preserve the bishop on d6. It helps to stop his knight e5 because very often in this opening white wants to get a grip over the square e5. And I'm trying to do the same with knight to e4, but I've got to think of the best way to break the pin on the knight on f6. So because I've castle kingside, I don't want to start playing moves like g5. I thought h3 was actually a slight weakness because it does make the bishop on d6 look stronger. I don't think he's going to bring the bishop back to g3 to oppose the bishop here. All right, so knight a4. Now, is that really a useful waiting move? It seems to be my opponent's strategy, or just overall like an overriding strategy to play unusual moves very fast and make me think a lot. It certainly worked in game number 1, where I flagged at the end. But knight a4, I just wasn't even sure what the idea was with knight a4. Maybe he wants to push c4, but okay, I'm happy with that. Just trade and put a pawn back on g4 or e4, for instance. So bringing the bishop back is rather unusual, back to e7, but the idea was so I could play knight e4, especially with the knight having wasted 2 tempi with a4 and c3. I didn't feel like I was any tempo behind. If bishop at b4, I can just answer bishop d6, but I feel like all these trades are favoring black because now it's black that has the grip over e4, and I can trade knights and just dump the other one in on e4. And I'm quite happy with this position, while maintaining no weaknesses at the same time. So the bishop on f5, useful to cover the light squares, possibly sack on h3 if the opportunity arises. Now, what is this knight a2? So FeegLood has made some very strange knight moves, and this seems to be more of a chess move than a crazy house move. Maybe there's a long-term plan of knight c1, d3, e5. But even that, he's wasted a lot of tempi just getting the knight to the same place that I have, just obtaining a mirror kind of position. So I think black has a serious edge here, and I'm looking for something decisive already. I mean, I don't mean checkmate, but something to open up the position, take advantage of these slightly loose dark squares with g3, f2. So bishop at d6, just putting more pressure on the dark squares. Bishop e5, I think, is a good move to block that out. I don't want to trade just yet, but I'm looking at a sack on f2, followed by knight to e4, and only then swapping bishops on e5, or playing f6. So playing f6 here is not weakening at all, because there is both dark and light square coverage with the bishop on f5, plus the pawns on f6 and h6 and g7. So he's leaving the rook, going for a counter-attack on the dark squares like g7, which is a good idea. I should have played f6 straight away, because also the queen is opened up if he ever sacks the knight on g7. So f6 was the move here. I decided to trade. This is a little bit risky, because then something will appear on f6, like bishop at f6 very soon. Then it becomes dangerous. So I have to plug that hole, I don't mind sacking a rook back, because the f-file could become a problem for him. Now, what I really want in the next 2 or 3 moves is a knight for e4. So I'm doing anything to grab a knight. I'm really hoping for knight takes f6 check. Then I'll just take back with the rook, which is okay. I don't even mind sacking 2 rooks. I just want that knight on h5. Anything for the knight. So my next move is going to be bishop back to g6. I will sack on f4. Otherwise, if he goes back to g3, then bishop at g3, or even pawn at g3. Sorry, pawn at h4, bishop at h4. So knight b4. I'm not even looking at that side of the board. I don't care what that knight is doing. Maybe he wants to sack on d5, but that's okay. I just take once, put the bishop back on e6. I'm still quite happy with this position because he will give me his knights, one or the other, in one way or the other. And he doesn't have any pawns to cover on squares like h2 or g3. So I think the main squares he has to cover are e4, f2, and g3. Because I'm going to take this knight, I'm going to stick it on e4, and then he's in big trouble on the dark squares. So this is a vicious counterattack. He's desperate to get into g7. And he may even sack the queen on the bishop on e6. But with only a rook in hand, it's definitely not enough to mate. I'm anticipating he's going to go rook at g7, rook takes g6, trying for pawn back on g7. Yep, this is what happens. But now I have the first check, knight at e4, and I felt like there was a mate here. I'm just deciding which piece to drop on f2. I mean, pawn at f2 is tempting, bishop f2, but queen at f2 is the strongest move, and there is a mate to follow up. Now, I hope the audience enjoyed this one. I'm a bit of a crowd pleaser sometimes. I know this is quite a big audience gathering. So queen sacrifice on h3, knight on g5. The point is knight takes rook at h4 is checkmate. If king g4, there is f5 check to follow up, and bishop at g3. If rook takes, then knight takes, the king is forced to move, and f5 and rook at e4 to finish. So I'm particularly pleased with the finish here because this comes from what the audience would call a boring opening, d4, d5. And I was really pleased to crack open with a sack on f2 at the right time. So strategically, the sack on f2 was at the right time because it was after the move knight from c3 to a2, which is removing a knight offside where it didn't have any relevance to the main action which was going on the king side. So that's just a very subtle point to notice about the timing of sacrifices. So I now have a 4-2 lead. We're going back to the same opening again. Now I did lose game number 5. Game number 5. So this is game number 7. So I lost playing f3. Now I'm certainly not going to repeat that again. That was a disaster after f3. Yeah, we know Ben Feingold says never play f3, and it's true in Crazyhouse sometimes as well. Never play f3. Sometimes it's a good move, but only when you can exchange the f pawn for the g pawn and weaken the g4 pawn. Open up the f file, bring the knight back to f3. So I thought it's very useful here to cover this diagonal from b8 to h2. So this is why I played bishop f4. There's no particular threats with this move, but it does stop bishop d6. It does help to prevent the attack he did last game with h4 and h3 and so on. And I'm just asking my opponent how he's going to improve his position because it's not so obvious. Yeah, you can see some of my facial expressions. It's been a very intense, very stressful match so far. Every game is close. So bishop, I don't want to allow the bishop to c6. So bishop comes back. This helps support the f3 advance. In some positions, I may want to sacrifice for 2 pawns, but he does have rook h4 or maybe bishop f5 to follow up. Okay, knight b4. This took me by surprise. I thought he might be intending knight for d5 So knight from b4 to d5. Exchange knights. Try and drive the bishop back to g3. Then he has moves like h4 coming. So I thought about just ignoring it and playing f3, but then knight d5 does come with tempo. So then I'm looking at how to stop knight from b4 to d5. So this explains the next move, which is pawn at e4. And I just want to play a3 and kick back the knight to c6 where it's less useful. Because it looks like also his bishop wants to be on c6 at the moment. And that runs his knight on b4 out of squares completely. So I think this is a very good position for white. White is controlling the center. Has a safe king, even though those pawns are approaching. And black has no obvious moves in this position. Times are about equal, 144 each. So it's really the pressure is on black here because he's 4-2 down in the match. White has a very healthy edge in this position. And just intending a3, next move. There's also ideas of f3. There's maybe d5 at the right time as well. Or perhaps a3 followed by d5. So it's really black who has to prove something here. Knight to a4. Was not expecting this at all. Okay, I have c2 covered twice, so I'll exchange, draw the bishop, what I think is not to a very useful square. Now looking to attack on the king side, open up somehow. He doesn't seem to be threatening anything, so I'm just going to kick the knight back, intending knight c6 and then d5. He may try to counter attack. Okay, so bishop should just drop back to e3. I'm also considering bishop takes c7. I just wasn't sure after bishop c7, queen takes, pawn takes b4, if he has some way to use that queen on h2, but doesn't look like it. I mean, there's bishop d6 coming. Maybe I can even grab the bishop on a4, allow bishop takes h2 check. Because if he's controlling the dark squares but not the light squares, with the knight on e1, I still feel very safe. I decided to play what I thought was the safest move, bishop e3. Here he comes. Right, he's going to drop a pawn back on f3 or f4 or h3, something like this. Alright, so I'm going to leave that there. I want the f-file open, so I'm going to leave the bishop there and now counterattack somehow. Thought about sacking the other bishop. Knight somewhere, knight at e5. Don't know about this move. But I want to get into f7, so it seemed like a good idea at the time. And as I said, I don't care if he takes on e3. F takes will be my immediate response. And with a big attack on f7. So now here trades of knights and queens are good for white because I feel like I'm getting in with the attack first along the d-file, even if there's no immediate mate threat. So down to about 30 seconds each. And if it's my move, I'll go knight takes knight, followed by bishop takes f4. I'm expecting take on e3, take back. I'm happy with the queen trade, as I said before. Now here, this move doesn't seem to threaten anything. I should play pawn at g6. Why am I hesitating? He can't take it because of queen takes queen. But this is just like an over finesse. Knight f2 is very good complicating. I should take the queen and then the bishop. I should take the queen on d8 and then the bishop because queen at h1, king f2 is nothing. I'm trading in the wrong way because I missed the next move. Actually, a brilliant move from FeegLood, using the rook in hand that he just got for d2. This is a very good move and I'm in trouble. I really don't know what to do. Should I move the queen? Should I sack the queen? Should I take the rook on h8? It's just so hard to decide in 10 seconds. I decided to leave it. I should have probably blocked the d file with knight at d6 and tried to take the rook on d2. This is just too hard to work out with 5 seconds. So I threw in a check. This is not a very good move. Again, knight at d6 I think was the move here. Knight at d6 check. Take the bishop, sack the queen. I completely missed. This is a brilliant move again. G3 check. So king g1. He wants to take the queen. He wants to take whatever he can. I had to take back with the e bishop because then queen takes d1 was not checkmate. I believe I could take with the rook. And then the rook is covering... No, sorry. E2 was clear, that's right. So in the game, bishop at f2, queen at g1 was checkmate. But if I took with the e bishop, maybe he could sneak around the other way on h2. But the move he did in the game, queen takes d1, is not enough to mate because then rook takes d1, king f1, king e2. So it was just a bit too much to work out. Maybe he had a forced mate anyway with queen at h2, but... not entirely sure. Okay, so he's coming back 4 games to 3. This is game number 8. I have not played this opening before. It's not a very good match strategy. I probably should have stuck to what I know the best. I've been playing this pawn sacrifice with e5. But yeah, bishop g4 I thought was also a move, but it's... he seems to be getting what he wants from the opening here, which is a very safe position. Just easy development, piling up the pieces on e5. Exchanges are in white's favor. So I could choose to swap on e5, swap the bishop on e2, but I still have problems along the e file. And with the d7 square as well, so pawn at d7 I've got to watch out for. So this explains dropping the bishop back to e6, but it's not the best opening for black. I'm not going to repeat this one. I'm going to find a better move order. So the other games have been e4, e5. So I'm the one to first switch it up on move 1 with d5. And I'm not happy with the outcome of this opening. So I was expecting just knight takes followed by knight e5. Knight g5 also may be possible. There's many ways to play this. Maybe bishop g5. At some point. I could probably just castle as well. So if he exchanges on c6, I don't want him to get a bishop in hand because then bishop at b7 can be a bit nasty. A pawn at b7, not so much of a worry. He might try bishop b5, and then I'll have to guard c6 because I don't have any counterattack. Okay, castle. So now I have a move. Maybe he's just waiting for me to develop the bishop on f8, and then he wants to attack with pawn at h6. Maybe he'll wait for me to castle and then go pawn at h6. I didn't really want to go pawn at h3 in this position because I felt like I've moved the bishop, the light square bishop, too many times already, and he'll probably just answer taken rook e1, and then I've got problems along the e file again. So bishop d6, okay, nice solid move, but still I think very healthy edge for white. Alright, bishop b5, I don't have a lot of choice. I've just got to guard the square on c6. I mean, in some similar positions, black can castle kingside if they have some chance for a counterattack, but I felt like here I really didn't have anything, so just I'll play the most solid move, pawn at d7, and see what happens. I thought his attack here should be along the light squares, trying to exchange the bishop on e6. I thought maybe knight g5 would come. Since I've wasted the pawn, or well, put the pawn to good use at least, maybe bishop g5 is the other move, because I can't play pawn at f6, which I could in a previous variation. So just looking now at bishop e7, exchanging bishops, trying to keep a solid position again. Trying to make sure he doesn't have any nasty knight drops, because he can exchange a knight at any time. So I've got to keep f5 covered. That's the job of the bishop on e6. I'm just expecting a trade of bishops, but he doesn't have to trade. Maybe he'll drop back. Maybe he's thinking about game number 6, where he traded the dark square bishops in black's favor. Maybe just bishop e3, bishop f4. All right. So again, I have a move up my sleeve. I can do whatever, but not easy to find a very healthy move. I don't want a castle because of pawn at h6. I actually want him to trade knights, so that's why I'm going knight at g6. Trying to make use of the rook on h8 somehow. Yeah, expecting bishop g3, h5. Of course it's risky, but maybe I should just castle kingside instead. Maybe castle kingside here. But there's several ways for white to proceed. He probably should just ignore the h4 advance. Yeah, knight d4, very good move. If I ever play h4 take on g3, he's playing f takes g3, opening up the f file. A little bit like I did in game number 7, wasn't it? The previous game. So again, very good move. Pawn at f5. I'm trying to trap his bishop, so at least I'm not losing too much material. So I played king f8 so I can take back on e6 with the d pawn. That way his bishop on b5 is not pointing at anything. Doesn't seem to be too useful as an attacking piece. I probably should just take on g3 and hope for the best, because I do have f takes bishop at e3 check. But yeah, I decided to take back this way, which is also okay. Take the bishop, just get back some material. And here I needed to play pawn at f5. Yeah, it was a complete oversight. I didn't see the threat of knight takes e6 check. Yeah, and it's completely dead lost after that. So I've got the right idea to attack on the light squares, but I needed to play pawn at f5 first. This is just a gross blunder, and that's game over after this. Like, I could resign. Just kind of in shock at the moment over this blunder. But yeah, pretty horrendous blunder. I needed a heavy piece to do anything, but the problem is as soon as I take the rook, he's got pawn at e6, and it's a mate in 5 or something. Pretty easy finish for white. Yeah, so I can't take knight at d4 check, queen e6 to follow, or pawn at e6, queen f7, queen h5, and because of the bishop on e3 supporting the queen, it's mate in 1. That's it, well played. 4 games each. So the momentum has swung very much in this match. FeegLood's on a roll, 2 games in a row, 4 games each. So now we have played this opening, 4 times, with some slight variations from both players. And I felt like it's gone pretty well in game number 3 and game number 7. So I was still quite happy, that's why I'm repeating the same line. And I felt like bishop f4 is a pretty decent move in this position, because it attacks and defends, stops bishop d6. Okay, so here he's found a different approach, and I wasn't sure whether his plan was knight g6 or knight d5, knight ed5. Either are possible. So perhaps if I go pawn at e4, then he wants to swing the knight over to g6, and there it's more useful than on b4, because it may support the kingside attack. So, not sure. I mean, f3, I'm hesitating because of knight g6. And then I don't know where the bishop goes. So I decided to trade first. And I think because I know he wants to hit the bishop on f4, he did that in a previous game, I'm going to support the bishop by piling up on this diagonal bishop at e5. I think this is a good move. Ideas also a pawn at h6 or pawn at f6. obvious threat on c7. I thought maybe rook c8 or bishop at d6 or knight ed5. I was really shocked at this move, and he also made a comment after the game. He thought I'd be shocked, so he got that right. Knight e4 intending knight d6, obvious threat. So he's defending with the bishop, opening up the bishop from f8. Right, so I have to decide here, should I drop the pawn immediately on h6, or maybe a move like knight d3 would be also useful. Extra support on the bishops, intending knight dc5 as well. So just poking around that black queen, back to the 8th rank. I even thought about playing a chess-like maneuver like a4, a5, just kicking away the knight on b6. So now the other knight moves. All right, queen comes back. Now here's where I probably should play pawn at e4. So I'd like a knight in hand for c7. I also want to knock away the knight from d5. Now this is one way to do it, but he's getting a lot for the queen. So he's going to take on c4, and he's going to end up getting 2 pawns and a knight for the queen, which is a roughly even trade. I mean, I did this because I'm assuming I'm going to get a knight one way or the other for a square like e5 or c5. I should have played queen b3. We actually made a big study of this after the game. So queen b3 turns out to be very good for white, because I'll sack if I have to for a knight. I'll play a move like bishop takes g7, and then all these squares open up for the knight and the queen together. But knight c5, the idea was to take on d5 and sacrifice the queen that way. But very good move in response, pawn at d3, blocking out the queen. I'm trying to sneak around the pawn with queen b3, ideas of take c4 and also queen b7. But he can defend both squares at once with knight at a5. And I actually thought, already I'm in big trouble, because his counter attack is going to be swift with knight at e2 followed by pawn at f3, or the other way around. And the knights on c4 and d5, especially with support from the knight on a5, mean that I don't have any way into the king. I mean, just look at that pawn structure. Pawns guarding the light squares, knights all guarding the dark squares, bishops piled up on the dark squares. But even if I sack a queen for the knight, there's no drops. There's no useful drops with a knight. So what's the move? Do I leave the queen hanging? I need some tricky way to deflect one of the knights. So I'm actually looking at leaving the queen there on b3 and doing a move like bishop takes g7 to try and clear the e5 and the f6 square, possibly for a knight drop and a deflection of the knight on d5. And I thought at this stage, this is all I have to go on. It's not much, but it's going to take him 2 tempi to attack. But after pawn at f3, I also need 2 tempi to attack. So this is why after pawn at f3, I actually need a defensive move, because he's threatening knight at e2 check, f takes g2 check, knight takes f4, and it's mate. So I need to clear the square h2, because h2 is harder for him to access. So if he goes knight at e2 check, then I'll play king h2. And then he doesn't have another knight yet to drop on f3. Even if he takes the rook, even if it's check, it doesn't matter, because he'll still need an extra 2 tempi to attack. So h3, it's the best try. He does the obvious move, f takes g2. All right, so it's still going to take him 2 tempi to attack. Now I can do something. And the only thing I discovered in 5 seconds is queen takes c4. What else? Now we realized after the game that queen at c7 was an unbelievable way to make a draw, which is not great considering the match situation, but it's better than a loss, certainly. But yeah, this just doesn't quite lead to me. The knight covers d7, even the sack looks okay, but I'm just 1 pawn short. He'll run either way, doesn't matter. And yeah, unfortunately for white's attack is just petered out at the end. because I'm 1 pawn short. So that was game 9 to FeegLood. As I said, we spent quite some time studying that game after the match. And it turns out there's some incredible resources from both players. And I did miss some chances. But it was risky to start off with c4 and pawn at d7, making him sack the queen, because I had a lot of other safer ways to play. And you know, again, just keep the bind. You know, keep the pressure, keep the central control. There's not a lot of ways for black to improve his position if I just played a move like pawn at e4 instead of c4. Okay, so in a 10-game match, it really doesn't matter how many brilliant games, how many blunders you make, whatever happens in the previous games. The practical players would know you just have to forget about whatever happens in the previous games and just get on with it. It's something I really failed to do very well in this match, because the wheels have started to fall off. I started the match on fire, even though I lost the first one on time, but FeegLood actually said after the match he could have easily lost it 6-0, which isn't quite true, because yeah, game 5 I think he was winning pretty much the whole game, but yeah, certainly the score could have easily been 5-1 in my favor. But yeah, he's on a streak now, 3 in a row, and this opening, I've gone back to e4, e5, but this opening I'm not happy with. I really not sure what to do in this position. I should probably just go knight takes e4. Queen e7 looks good because there's a check on e4, and I'm avoiding the queen trade. But yeah, he has a very nice response, which I completely missed. So probably knight takes e4 is the most critical in that position instead of queen e7. It looks like I've got everything covered, but yeah, knight db5, excellent move from white. So making me waste time defending c7. Maybe I should even just leave it there somehow. I don't know whether a move like knight takes e4 is possible in this position, but I've got to find some way to counter it. I can't let him just maul on all my dark squares and not have anything in return. I thought this was the best way to cover c7 and also keep pressure on e4, but again, very good move. So compared to a previous game, I don't have this pawn at a3 counterattack, because the knight on b5 does such a good job attacking and defending, covering a3 and c3. I don't have knight takes e4, obviously. Pawn takes e4, blocking the e file doesn't seem to help. And he's just intending bishop takes f6. So I've got to cover c7. There's not many ways to do it. So I'm looking at bishop a5. There's really not much else. Queen takes e4 leaves too many pieces hanging. Again, maybe there's some way to just leave c7 hanging if I can find the right move to counterattack, but I'm just not seeing it at the moment. It's just a very good opening from white. So I'm trying to defend, but no, it's all white from here. So bishop takes, queen takes. Another way to do it is knight takes c7 check, trying to distract the bishop from a5. And then eventually get a knight to d5 with tempo. Alright, so bishop e2 means queen takes e4 doesn't come with check. I'm trying to kick the knight away, hoping he's not going to take on c7, but no, he's too clever for that. So yeah, it's already completely winning for white. He's going to take f6, take d5. I'm trying to hold it together with a check, but it's just not enough. I mean, objectively, the best move is queen g7, allowing knight at f6 check, sacking the rook. But there's just too many holes on the dark squares. It's not coverable. Even though I've got two dark square bishops, they're not doing anything to cover the key squares on f6, e7, g7. So, I mean, sacking the queen might prolong the game a few moves, but no, it's too much. Now, pawn at d6, bishop has to waste time again. Materially speaking, I almost have enough for the queen, but the problem is just the initiative with the pawn drops. Also very good move, knight at h6. I can't take that because of queen h8 check. And he's picking up a whole rook with attack on f7 at the same time. I have nothing. No, it's lost. So d7's cute because bishop takes queen f8 mate, but yeah, it's going to be mate anyway as soon as he blocks out the retreat on f6. And there's too many mate threats to cover after that. There's e8, there's f8. I didn't find it in 3 seconds, so that's it. That ends the match. Checkmate. So very well played to FeegLood. Yeah, it was the most intense match I've had so far. Was really looking in good shape in the first half of the match, taking a 4-2 lead. But he came back very strongly, especially with the white pieces. I had a couple of bad openings with black, and also he switched up his move order a little bit, came up with some new ideas as black in the e4 knight f6 kind of opening. And yeah, I mean, we're just making some comments after the match that even he felt like I was outplaying him at the start of the match. The time pressure was a big factor, as I mentioned a few times. Yeah, and I do like slower time controls. It's certainly my preference to play slower time controls if possible, because I don't have a lot of bullet or hyper bullet experience when it comes to the quick finishes in 2 seconds. So I'll leave it here. If you're interested in doing some analysis on game number 9, which is that where he sacked a queen on d7. Please look into that yourself, because there's some really exciting discoveries that we made after the match. But I'm going to sign off from here. So thanks for watching, everybody. FeegLood takes on either Master 10 or Arca 50, the Atomic World Champion, in the next round of the main bracket. And myself, Mugwort, moves on to the loser bracket, or I could call it now the elimination bracket, since that I'm in it, and I'm not going to call myself a loser. No, just kidding. But for the loser bracket, I have to win 3 in a row. And it's even possible that I'll play another GM Penguin or Andrew Tang in the next match. But I'll have to wait probably a few weeks or maybe a month until that match. The loser bracket has a bit of catching up to do. So looking forward to that one. I can now focus on some other things like maybe a bit more Bug House or some Blindfold Crazyhouse or something new and exciting. So stay tuned for more streams, for more videos, maybe also a bit of commentary and some other matches. Take care, everyone. I'll see you soon. Thanks for watching.